any financial and social considerations which have always imposed and will to continue to impose constant and increased awareness of the relationship between consumption and production, expansion of social movements in food, and the reasons for the rapid development seen over recent years are numerous and are associated with the parallel growth and extension of research of the field of humanities. So, food became a legitimate topic of academic research with limitless richness and novelty as it is linked to all aspects of social life. It is the basis of any economy and the linchpin of the political strategies of nations and households. Food emphasizes social differences, the limits, bonds, and contradictions of a society. Food, recipes, and dietary practices can tell us a great deal about how and why people think, act, and acknowledge themselves in particular ways. Food defines social relations, power, inclusions and exclusions, cultural ideas on hierarchy, and the human body. Food is an endlessly evolving enactment of human relations. Food is life, and life can be studied and understood through food, as food links body and soul, self and other, the personal and the political, the material and the symbolic, as Carol Cunningham and Penny van Esterik observe in the excellent publication they edited entitled Food and Culture. Today we have with us two distinguished guests. Professor Johannes Koder, who alongside his significant contribution to Byzantine and post-Byzantine studies, is one of the main researchers into diet during the Byzantine period. Under the fascinating title, From Phaba to Kuru Fasulye, Everyday Life in Constantinople, he will present the composition of meals in Byzantine and early Ottoman cuisine during the 15th and 16th centuries, revealing elements of tradition and innovation of Constantinopolitan cuisine. My colleague, Niki Tsironi, Byzantinist at the National Hellenic Research Foundation, will speak on food as spirit and spirit as food in Byzantium. The book by Marvin Harris, entitled Good to Eat, ended as follows. We must know more about food as nourishment, and we must know more about food as profit. Only then we will really be able to know food as thought. We shall therefore be very interested to learn about food as spirit in the Byzantine era. Dear colleagues, thank you kindly for accepting our invitation. Professor Koder, please take the floor. As always, the questions and the comments about the speeches can be made at the end of the second lecture. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I have to thank Evangelia Balta for the nice and kind introduction. And as she told already, I think it's very important that after half an hour about material aspects of eating and drinking, the spiritual, the ideological aspect will be discussed with our colleague, Mrs. Tsironi. Let me say that I'm grateful for this invitation to speak to you at the end of an interesting series of lectures on Byzantium and early Ottoman gastronomy. My congratulations to the organizers. Istanbul changed a lot since I visited it for the first time nearly half a century ago, and this is a remnant of this year. But it is still a lively and still a beautiful city. I like to visit it again and again, and I'm glad to be with you this evening. Now to the everyday food. At the end of the 12th century, the Archbishop of Athens, Michael Choniatis, wrote a letter to a friend in Constantinople and asked him, quotes, "What are you short of? Are not the wheat-bearing plains of Macedonia and Thrace cultivated for you? Is not the wine from Evia and Pteleon and Chios and Rhodos pressed for you? Do not all streams of goods flow together in the imperial city like in one sea?" Quotes ending. Constantinople was a special case. It was one of the few Byzantine megalopolis which were not able to rely on their hinterland only, and it was, of course, the most important of these cities. Fortunately, this capital of two empires through 1600 years was situated near the sea, a fact which made the logistics of supply with provisions easy. Grain, for example, was imported always by ship in the early period from Egypt after the end of the Annona until the 70s of the 11th century from the western parts of Asia Minor, and later mainly from the coastlands of the Aegean and the western Black Sea. Shortage of bread and other staple food was an important political factor. It could provoke riots, as the capital's population reached far more than 100,000 all over the Middle Ages, not to speak about 400,000 and perhaps even 500,000 inhabitants until the great Justinianic plague, pestilence, in the 40s of the 6th century. In general, we observe that self-evident facts of everyday life in the past mostly were not written down, but transmitted by oral tradition from generation to generation. They were learned by practice. In societies in which literacy is not a self-evident standard, written texts make only sense if a significant number of the respective addressees is able to read them. Hence, also information on Byzantine cuisine, recipes, and the composition of meals from contemporary written sources are rare. Therefore, we combine the few surviving Byzantine recipes with our knowledge about the primary constituents, with information coming from archaeological sources, and with recipes of the medieval Baghdad kitchen and the Ottoman kitchen of the 15th and 16th centuries. In the end, we find in the cuisine of Constantinople elements of tradition and of innovation as well. An important leveling of nutrition results from the detailed religious prescriptions for Lenten periods, which in a large variety of prohibitions lasted nearly half of the year. In principle, Lent had to be observed by all Christians, but it was probably observed with more austerity in the monasteries. Lenten rules excluded meat and reduced also the consumption of fish, cheese, and oil. During Lent, it was generally recommended to eat late in the day, vradifayin, and to eat little, vrachifayin. The opposite, the luxurious diet, the avrodieton, was considered as despised. The number of daily meals is explained by the 11th century scholar Michael Psellos. He is very clear in this. In a short poem on moderation, he says 2 meals. Monastic life also allowed normally 2 meals a day, though some monasteries conceded only 1. The first meal was the ariston. It was normally consumed at the 6th hour of the day, between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. The second, richer meal was the deipnon. Normally it would be consumed in the evening before sunset. It is likely that for the majority of people, a hot cooked meal was normally offered only once a day, and in this case, probably it was the deipnon. This was the hot meal. Why often only 1 hot meal a day? This question leads to a major problem, namely that fuel was expensive and rare, not only in Constantinople, but also in smaller towns and in parts of the countryside. The standard fuel, xylon capsimon, often consisted of brushwood, dry branches, bark, fir cones, nut shells, but also dry dung from cattle or camels. Byzantine word is zarzakon, the Turkish was and is tezek. All this material was of minor burning quality and a low burning temperature. Even more expensive than normal firewood was hardwood and charcoal, carvunin, which was needed primarily for artisanal purposes, for example, for smithies. What was everyday food for the masses? For a period of more than a millennium, it is impossible to give detailed and specific answers in half an hour. Everyday food was above all bread, gruel, and soup. Furthermore, olives, fresh or preserved vegetables and fruits, salted or dry fish and caviar, dairy products as cheese and oxygalon, sour milk, eggs and certain vegetables and fruits were only seasonal available. The consumption of fresh fish and meat, but also smoked meat and bacon, depended not only on the individual economic situation, but also on the seasons and the Lenten rules. In the early period, gruel or porridge still was so common as food as bread. The gruels were called athiras and defined as bread, which was, according to a science biography, quotes, boiled in pots after leavening, or as a gruel-like porridge made from grinded wheat. The dietitian Anthimos, in a letter entitled On the Observation of Food, a letter written to the king of the Franks in the beginning of the 6th century, recommends to cook the gruel with goat's milk so that it may have a consistence like butter. Another basic and cheap meal was an athiras made of semolina or bulgur, in Greek pliguri, boiled in sheep milk or in water, sometimes with some drops of olive oil or another cooking fat. Athiras is mentioned as food for the poor people. It could be combined with vegetables or fish. It is obvious to mention here also trachanas, or tachana, the leavened dough made from milk or yogurt, onions, pepper, and spices, sun-dried and grinded, a well-known base for gruels and soups like tarhana, çorbası. In a Byzantine text, it is described as a milky cake. The Byzantines made trachanas also from wheat grits. For both varieties, an ancient name was tragos, and I mentioned that tragos normally is the name for the billy goat, but in this case it's also used in this use. From the 6th century onwards, the most common food was bread. Normally the Byzantines used to eat leavened bread, artos, psaumion, which was clearly distinguished from rask, paximadion, and from unleavened bread, azimon. It was often consumed as main food with olives and cheese, and as a side dish with nearly every meal, also to take up bits of meat or to dip it into sauces. Bread was produced in different qualities. The finest quality was afraton. It was normally baked every day fresh, often sprinkled with sesame, and consumed by preference warm from the oven. Afraton was more expensive than normal bread. In monasteries, it was therefore often reserved for the abbots. The cheaper bread, which could be afforded by a significant part of the population, was called mesokatharon, of middling purity, made of bran or barley. The Ptochoprodomos, the poor Prodomos, calls the cheap bread in his 12th century satirical poems the bread of poverty. As already mentioned, bread was present at nearly every meal. In the end of the 11th century, to quote just one example, Michael Ataliates instructs the monks of his monastic foundation that they should invite every day a certain number of poors for a meal consisting of bread combined with meat or fish or cheese or boiled legumes or other vegetables, quotes, whatever God is sending, quote sending. Warm meals for the masses often consisted of bread and soups. The variety of soups was big. The cheapest was the so-called holy soup, ayosoumin. Ptochoprodomos explains the name. It was only for saints, sufficient as food. In its most holy consistence, this soup was cooked with water, onions, salt, marjoram, and a tiny quantity of oil. A normal soup was made from vegetables or legumes, pasta or bread, olive oil, wine, also with curd or cheese. The manifold possibilities to add ingredients transformed the simple soup into a veritable meal containing pieces of fish or meat, both fresh or salted. In this case, it was no more a soup, but a hot pot, monokithron, as the Byzantines called it, because all ingredients were cooked together in one kithra. Ptochoprodomos described in a daydream a super monokithron. His fish hot pot consists of cabbage, eggs, Cretan and black cheese, cream, garlic, onions, pepper, plenty of oil, and a great variety of fresh and dry and salted fish, poured over in the end with wine. In principle, we compare this hot pot with early Ottoman dishes like kefal baligye çorbası, uskumru baligye yahni, or papaz yahni, and all consisting also in principle from fish, onions, olive oil or butter, vinegar, eggs, pepper, and other spices. Meat hot pot is similar, replacing the fish by mutton, especially belly, kidneys, mesonephrin, and other innards from the sheep, comparable perhaps to a lamb, yachne, or a budai chorba, which consisted of chickpeas and lamb. Most important were vegetables which were grown in and near Constantinople on both sides along the Theodosian walls in fields of altogether some 16 square kilometers, outside but also within the walls, where free space is confirmed, for example, by the 12th century visitor Odo of Deuil, who observes explicitly that one third of the town, inframuros, inside, consists of fields with vegetable gardens. Let me mention that the tradition of horticulture inside the Theodosian walls survived not only the Byzantine era but also the Ottoman centuries, and could be observed still in the late 20th century between Jedikule and Belgrade Kappe, but also in the quarters of Samatia, Yalle, and Langa along the sea walls. One chapter in the 10th century agricultural manual Geoponica offers, quotes, information what every month has to be sown and transplanted according to the climate of Constantinople, quotes ending. We learn from it about a great variety of endive and green salads as well as other vegetables. Many of them are well known in our times, as for example, dill, carrot, fenugreek, white cabbage, kohlrabi, cress, leek, mangold, radish, beetroot, turnip, and onion. The text mentions also other vegetables which are not so usual today. I just quote one example, Jewish mallow. It was named molochin from Arab muluchia, and it is still common in our days in the Levant and in Egypt as a vegetable soup. The mentioned chapter in the Geoponica does not speak about legumes and related or similar plants, though these were without doubt a staple food. The reason is that these could be transported over long distance from elsewhere and had not necessarily to be produced near Constantinople. Other vegetable products as olives, aubergine, artichoke, gourds, melons, and zucchini are not mentioned in this source because the climate of Constantinople in the 10th century was not favorable for them. So they were common. I could not find Byzantine recipes, but we may substitute them with the recipes from the early Arab or Ottoman cuisine as kabak, kalyesi, or peyneli, sakis, kabay, and so on, haleb dolma, and similar food. Spinach, the Byzantine spanakin, was well known in the late Byzantine and the early Ottoman kitchen as spanak, and eaten with meat or cheese, but it is not mentioned before the 12th century. Perhaps it was, or probably it was brought to the Mediterranean from Persia or Mesopotamia, where it was grown earlier, and it was brought by the Seljuk immigrants in the end of the 11th century or later. As the climate impeded for some months in winter the production of fresh vegetables, they were preserved in brine or vinegar brine, and they could, in such a way, be preserved for cold periods. And I mentioned that the other way is that in Egypt, these vegetables are preserved for the hot summer months. The Byzantine name of vegetable pickles like cabbage leaves and beetroots was almea. The Arab turşu, from which derives Turkish turşu and modern Greek tursi, was introduced as name later. Boiled halmeia without oil was consumed during Lenten. A traditional recipe, for example, consists of beet and garlic in a brine made from vinegar, oil, salt, and honey, the Ottoman pancar turşusu. Pulses also had great importance all over the year. They were so common in all social classes that the Byzantines could be nicknamed bean eaters, chiamufai. In the 6th century, Anthimos lists broad beans, chickpeas, lentils, and lupins, which he recommends to season with oil, salt, coriander, vinegar, and sumac. The Byzantines liked a pulse meal called Phaba, a cassoulet which was served as a soup in pots or more thickened in bowls. Phaba, as you know, is common also today in some countrysides and islands. In Byzantine recipes, it was mixed with pearl barley and then called pasta or alfita. The medieval Latin equivalent for Greek pasta was polenta, a well-known term also in our times. We have no problems to compare the variety of pulse meals with common recipes of soups and stews in the Ottoman cuisine and in our time, for example, Kuru, Fasulye, mercimek, çorbası, and so on. Some milk products were rather common. Sour milk, oxygalon, was sold in the streets of Constantinople by the oxygalatades, who carried their products, quotes, in earthenware on their shoulders. Fresh milk was unusual as food or as drink for adults. Only babies and little children were fed with the creamy goat's milk, whereas to drink the milk from cattle or buffaloes was generally associated with foolishness and lack of culture, and this sometimes in very drastic poems. Cheese was made from sheep and goat's milk. It came from all parts of the empire to the capital. It was sold in the markets, but also in the grocers, by the grocers, Saldamarii. Ptochoprodromos, for example, liked vlachikon, tiri, but abhorred cheese from Crete. The luxury level of cuisine, to avrodiaton, was, along with the most sumptuous varieties of the already mentioned monokithra, every dish consisting of fresh fish or meat. A source from the 14th century mentions a rich man's meal consisting of warm bread and sesame seed, rolls fresh from the oven, pancakes, honey cakes, roast hare and kid, and a variety of poultry, fish, pulse, and salt meat. Lamb, mutton and goat's meat was highly esteemed. Also sheep offal, which was filled in the intestines and roasted, probably similar to kokoretz in our times. Bishop Luitprand of Cremona in the 10th century describes an imperial present to him from the Emperor Niki. The greasy roasted billy goat, which is seasoned with garlic, onions, leeks, and the fish sauce garum, makes him feel very sick. Usually was also the consumption of wild boar and pork, and Anthimos recommends sucking pig cooked in a sauce or well roasted in oven, provided that the heat is not too strong. Salt meat, ham, and bacon, apoctine, lardin, was popular from pork, but it could be made from every meat. In the Levant, also from camel. We have mentioned camel, lardin, several times in the early period. There's no doubt about the importance of fish and seafood. The regulations for the Guild of Fishmongers, Ichthyoprate, and other sources make it evident that fish of good quality was expensive. It was always expensive. The Byzantine fish book, Opsarologos, mentions more than 40 species, and fish came from the Straits and the nearby parts of the Marmara Sea and the Black Sea, but also from fish farms, ichthyotrophia, and from fishing installations in lagoons, the so-called epoche. Sun-dried or pickled or sold fish was imported from the northern shores of the Black Sea. Fish and seafood of lower quality, especially caviar, the so-called salted eggs, were cheap. Hence, caviarocatalitis, caviar destroyer, was a rude name. This was fish, sorry. About sweets and confectionery, the information from written sources is extremely rare in Byzantium. I found recipes only of 3 dishes. 2 of them are documented also today. The lelengia or lalangia, in Turkish lalanga, were pancakes baked in the pan or directly on the hot plate and eaten with honey. Koliva, boiled wheat, was a common Lenten food, often offered in monasteries, but mainly served as a special dish prepared for memorial services. Ptochoprodromos prepared it with almonds, pomegranates, walnuts, hemp seeds, lentils, and raisins. This is almost identical with modern recipes. And you see here a koliva on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of the memorial service for the Archbishop Michael of Vienna, Michael Staikos, last summer. Finally, the Ptochoprodromos mentions a delicious Lenten food, a rice pudding which was prepared with honey. It was not served to all monks, but again only to the abbots of his monastery. Many dishes, also salads, were seasoned with spices which are known also later in the Ottoman kitchen and until today. Very common were onions, spring onions, and garlic. Liquid seasonings were vinegar, bitter orange juice, and the juice of unripe grapes, in Greek omphakion, Latin di frutum. Omphakion is also documented in Arabic and Ottoman recipes as kuruk. It became fashionable again in the European kitchen in the last years under the name verjus. Popular since the Roman period was the fish sauce garum. It could be blended with vinegar, oil, or wine, hence the oxygaron, eleogaron, inogaron. Sweeteners were honey, raisins, and other sweet dried foods. Very common was inomeli, wine honey, a concoction of honey with the juice from ripe grapes, the mustos. Cane sugar, Zaccharis, was expensive and is nearly not mentioned in Byzantine sources. It became more common in the late period, beginning with the late period, as a consequence of the enforced sugar production in the Levant, especially in Cyprus. Important was in some regions the fruit of the carob tree, in Greek keration, or early Greek also xyloglycon. Arab charub, from which the Byzantines produced a past or a syrup. Through the Byzantine literary texts, we know that carob pots usually were a food for pigs and therefore contemptible. But it seems that charupi was always eaten, at least by the poor from other sources, hagiographical sources. The carob fruit is also well known today. Its past is in the Levant, used for confectionery, or also for preparing a drink, charubia. Let me end with a short remark on drinks. Water. Normally warm or hot water was often mixed or seasoned with fennel or cumin seed or aniseed, but also with the already mentioned omphakion, inomeli, also fruit juices and syrups, finally with wine and vinegar. Altogether, there was a great variety of so-called efkrata, well-mixed drinks, which found its continuity in the numerous sherbets during the Ottoman period. In the 17th century, Evliya Celebi mentions 26 varieties of sherbet he was offered on the occasion of a festivity in Ohrid in Macedonia. Wine of good quality was expensive. Its durability was affected by preservation with resin, pitch, sulfur or gypsum. Wine was imported to Constantinople from all parts of the empire. Normally it would be mixed with warm or hot water. To drink wine pure, also to consume it in great quantities, was frowned. So the general impression from the sources is that this was not quite unusual. In this short paper, it was not possible to go into details. Many aspects I could discuss only shortly, or I didn't mention at all. We should also include the archaeological evidence, especially biological remains, and we should mention cookware and tableware, and finally we should speak about table manners, dining customs, and other non-material aspects of dining, which will happen now. But I hope to have offered at least a general view of everyday food for the great mass of Constantinople's population. Thank you.
Professor Koder, thank you very much for your conferences on the everyday meals in Constantinople. And now we call Niki Tsironi to continue.
Can I speak from there and change my PowerPoint, or shall I speak there? All right, thank you very much. And I would like to express sincerely my gratitude for the welcoming and for the invitation to take part in this meeting, where I am called to address food as spirit and spirit as food in the Byzantine tradition. Now, this is a rather challenging task, I would say, considering I come to speak after our great mentor, Professor Johannes Koder, who has said almost everything on the subject, thank you very much, as far as real people and real life is concerned. Professor Koder, if I may say, and add to the introduction of his work, already presented so nicely by Evangelia Balta, is one of the great scholars who have marked the great turning point in Byzantine studies, shifting the emphasis from conventionally apprehended history to a history focusing to everyday life and everyday culture. Everyday life and culture with emphasis on the food and wine and habits related to eating and drinking is also the topic of, well, look at the gentleman, thank you very much. Okay, so, is it hot? Okay, no, but it's perfect. So everyday life and culture with emphasis on the food and wine and habits related to eating and drinking is also the topic of the series of talks that I guess that most of you have been fortunate enough to attend, where a series of distinguished scholars came and presented their work to you, nicely chosen and put together in a very interesting program that I had the opportunity to read by Evangelia Balta, dear colleague. And many thanks to the consulate, to you for having us and for making this occasion possible. Now, the point of view I am called to present has to do with a topic that bridges earthly life with its food and drink habits with the symbolisms of the eternal reality that gave Byzantium its very distinct character. Religious belief, as a matter of fact, formed for Byzantium the common denominator which united people of different ethnic origins, cultural backgrounds, customs, beliefs, and even languages. It seems that Christianity, the new religion initially tolerated among so many others by Constantine the Great and later adopted as the official religion of the Byzantine Empire, played the role of the gluing material of all these otherwise irrelevant or even hostile to each other territorial regions, which at a certain time encompassed the entire space of the Eastern Mediterranean, including Balkans, but also a great deal of the Western Roman Empire. My part tonight, after the interesting and concrete paper of Professor Koder, is to shed light to the spiritual aspect of food. Except the directly relevant images that I have chosen to illustrate points of my talk tonight, I have also included paintings by the Greek artist Christos Bokoros. And now, okay, I was taken by surprise arriving here at the Sismanoglio because I saw these wonderful two photographs with works by Christos Bokoros. Now, this is part of a work by Bokoros called The Essentials, ta chriodi, what is essential in life. And this has been sent to us as a Christmas postcard a couple of years ago, accompanied by a wonderful poem saying, what does man really need to survive? You have received it too, yeah? Some bread, some wine, something to look up to think further ahead and further to be dreaming. Now, this is an improvisation. And here is my gluing material with Professor Koder. Here are the beans, ladies and gentlemen. And here I come in the story. So this is a wonderful painting by Christos Bokoros with the symbolic bread and wine and olives, and of course the symbolic two, the appenandi, the person who makes the existence meaningful in theology, but also in real life. And here is a work, a painting that we see also at the Sismanoglio. So these symbolic images, they really set the work of Bokoros in the context of the sacred in art. Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God, says Christ when tempted in Matthew 4:4 to turn the stones into bread. Powerful as anything, this phrase of Christ at the same time negates the importance of food, as man shall not live on bread alone, but also affirms it, taking for granted the simultaneous consumption, the taking in of material and spiritual food. The parallel has deep roots in ancient philosophy, but here is not the place to attempt to cover the wide spectrum of sheer value and powerful symbolisms that food had for man in ancient societies of the Eastern Mediterranean. Instead, I shall concentrate on the scriptures, drawing attention to the context and content that led to the development of Eucharistic theology during the Byzantine era. It is important not to forget that food for survival at these times, when goods needed to be acquired with a lot of toil and fatigue, was by no means given. A pleasant and welcoming landscape, a fertile ground, the abundance of water corresponds to the promised land, where food would be plentiful and where God would lead his people as described in the Deuteronomy, the book of the Old Testament. I quote, into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing forth in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land where you will eat food without scarcity, in which you will not lack anything, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. End of quote. The land where food is amply provided is described in a most vivid way, with water streams, valleys, with the fruit and the grains of the earth, and is somehow equated to an earthly paradise. The food in the scriptures is substance, but also notion. It is the real thing, the factual, tangible matter that ensures man's survival, while at the same time it becomes a medium of communication between man and God. Food provision either as a promise referring in the future or its supply at times of hardship, is used as metonymy, that is, as a symbolic way for the expression of God's love. And this is something that permeates the tradition of the East from the time of the Old Testament to the present day, I believe, as it represents the offering of the precious possession, or otherwise, the possession that through the act of offering becomes precious as a token of hospitality. Now, bread was of vital importance for survival in biblical times. In the Gospel of Matthew, and especially in his 13th chapter, we find no less than 4 parables having a farming content. The imagery in which the promised land is described in the Bible is telling of the narrative context within which fulfillment of physical needs is tied with a network of personal relationships between men and God, and with a symbolic character goods acquire in this context. In Genesis 17:7 we read, "I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, and all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." So we see that food and the presence of God are practically equated here. The land of Canaan, roughly corresponding to the Levant, that is the present-day Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, western Jordan, and southwestern Syria, we are told that was surrounded by countries with very successful farming methods. Sumerians cultivated the lands in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, and Egyptians the Nile Valley. These countries had already mastered irrigation and cultivation. The crops mentioned time and again in the Bible, grain grapes used for wine, and dried fruit and olives for oil, were the main crops cultivated in these regions that God promised to his people. Canaan was promised time and again to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as mentioned in Genesis 50:24. It was a land described as flowing milk and honey. This image is recorded in most biblical narratives, from Leviticus 20:24 to Numbers, Deuteronomy to Joshua 5:6. In all these variations of the main narrative, the main elements remain the imagery of the promised land as the end of the dark tunnel, the deliverance of evil, the reward for the endurance of suffering. This is the reason why we encounter its imagery in discourses of recent centuries, even the 20th century, and in sermons, talks, and especially, interesting, in the genre of Negro spirituals related to deliverance from slavery. Characteristic is the example of the 1968 speech of Martin Luther King. He says, "I just want to do God's will, and he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Food was provided by the Lord during the harsh way that led the people of Israel to the land of Canaan. It is interesting to note that in the narrative of Exodus 16, as elsewhere in the Bible, food possesses a double attribute: that of the substance necessary for survival, but also that of the factor of challenge and trial that human beings have to go through in order to attain to a more elevated mode of existence. This is clear in the excerpt of Exodus, where God instructs Moses and through him the people about the quantity of manna they should gather every morning. The ones who gather more than needed witness the amazing phenomenon of the food turning bad, smelly, and full of worms. This was the proof of God's wrath over people's greediness and wish to possess and save food for the next day. In an everlasting message, God commanded people not to worry about the next day, but to trust him and follow his commandments. The way God chooses to reach their hearts is food, precisely because of its vital nature for survival. And it is upon food that trust between man and God was built. And so God, having heard the complaints of the Jewish people, provides food for them, presenting them with yet another challenge of spiritual rather than of a physical kind. Then Moses said to Aaron, we read, "Announce this to the entire community of Israel. Present yourselves before the Lord, for he has heard your complaining," we read in Exodus. And as Aaron spoke to the whole community of Israel, they looked out toward the wilderness. There they could see the awesome glory of the Lord in the cloud. And then the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have all the bread you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening, vast numbers of quail flew in and covered the camp. And the next morning, the area around the camp was wet with dew. When the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. And the Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. "What is it?" they asked each other. They had no idea what it was. This episode, which is also recorded in the Quran, in chapter 257, hits a primordial chord in people's subconscious, thus evoking the deeper need that leads to the connection of man to the divine. Manna is also linked to the answer of Christ to Satan when tempted. "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." The Old and the New Testament form a whole, meant to justify one another through its typological connection. That is, the justification and fulfillment of prophecies recorded in the Old Testament through personages and events recorded in the New Testament. Thus, the manna of the Exodus definitely finds its typological counterpart in Christ's temptation, in precisely the same way in which the old Adam, the one who disobeyed God and was subsequently cast out of paradise, is met in his typological image by Christ. I would like us to focus our attention on this scene of Genesis that represents one of the most powerful scenes of the entire Bible. Adam disobeys the rules God set him, and as a result, he is cast out of paradise. Now the scenery is sinking into the dim light of the dusk, and the air is cold when God appears calling Adam, who is hiding out of shame. The dialogue is overwhelming. Adam accuses Eve, and Eve accuses the serpent, who is the first to be cursed by God, to go upon his belly. The consumption of the fruit from the tree of knowledge made Adam and Eve realize their nakedness, and henceforth the primordial sense of guilt associated with the unauthorized eating of the fruit that haunts humanity ever since. It is interesting to note that disobedience has not been a noetic process into which man was drawn as a result of an inner dialectic. It was not a discourse. It was a wake of the instinct associated with the taste of a fruit that the hand took and brought to the mouth to bite it, taste it, swallow it, and feel the consequence in its way of being and apprehending himself and the surrounding reality. So disobedience proves to have a distinct taste and a flavor, a physical dimension that is often not stressed enough in the readings of the Bible. Remarkable is the fact that equally physical to the taste of disobedience is the taste of salvation, which came about through the sacrifice of Christ and their commemoration in the divine liturgy. In the religious context of Christianity, food acquires a spiritual dimension that becomes part of Orthodox theology, at the very core of which we are to find the bread and the wine being transformed into the blood and body of Christ during the liturgy. In Byzantium, the Eucharist remained not simply the core of Orthodox practice, but also the subject of perennial interpretation, a lens, we might say, through which the major theological issues, like the Incarnation, but also soteriology, were to be approached with varying emphasis related to major theological currents, such as the theology of images in the 8th and 9th centuries, the time of the iconoclastic controversy, but also in the 14th century, time of the hesychast discourse led by Gregory Palamas. And these are just two examples. In the New Testament, references to food are numerous. The most striking examples are provided in the miracles of Christ performed at the Cana marriage, with which the miracles of Christ start in the New Testament, but also the episodes where Jesus fed the multitude. Now, this is not a single miracle, but two separate ones. The first is recorded in all four Gospels, so it is, and therein Christ is reported to have fed 5,000 people who followed him in a remote area and as the night fell were left without food. Now the second one, recorded only in the Gospel according to St. Matthew and Mark, records a crowd of 4,000 people that had been following Christ for 3 days, and once again the people are left without food. In both instances, Christ takes pity on them, gives thanks to God, and then takes, in this very liturgical gesture, takes the bread and breaks it, breaks the loaves of bread, which are miraculously multiplied, as well as the fish. The most solemn and loaded with significant moment, however, is the Last Supper, of course. The development of the liturgy has a lot to tell us about the way in which the Last Supper, the communal meal of Christ with his disciple that preceded his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and death, developed into the commemorative meal around which the ritual of the divine liturgy evolved with all its complicated layers of meaning and nuances. We are what we eat. Now, this is a phrase we often hear and which is associated with modern concerns regarding our diet. Originally, it comes from Anselme Brillat-Savarin, who in 1826 wrote in his Physiologie du goût, or Méditation de gastronomie transcendantale, dis-moi qu'est-ce que tu manges, je te dirai ce que tu es. Hein? Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you who you are. He follows me, that's great. Okay, so some years later, around 1863, 1864, Ludwig Andreas Feuerbach, in an essay entitled Concerning Spiritualism and Materialism, wrote that man is indeed what he eats. Of course, the statement was not meant to be taken literally in neither of the two cases. It rather stressed the relationship between a person's dietary habits and his state of body and spirit. In our times, the famous statement became a rallying cry of food experts, dietitians, nutritionists, and other propounders of health food and biological cultivations like Victor Lindlar, who developed the catabolic diet in the first half of the century. However, the idea admittedly also has religious origins, not only in the East, but also in the West. Modern scholarship looks into Western sources to retrieve the origins of this idea. It is known that Roman Catholics believe that during the divine liturgy, the bread and the wine are transubstantiated, that is, that the very matter out of which the bread and the wine are made changes into the very body and blood of Jesus Christ. Now, one of the most distinguished personalities of Western Christianity, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, born in 1489 at Nottinghamshire of England and burnt at stake, becoming food himself in 1556, was the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury for more than 20 years, from 1533 to 1556. He was also advisor to the English kings Henry VIII and Edward VI. As Archbishop, he put the English Bible in parish churches. He was a really extraordinary personality. He drew up the Book of Common Prayer that is still used to the present day in the Anglican Church and composed a litany that remains in use even today. Eventually, he was denounced by the Catholic Queen, Mary I, for promoting Protestantism and, here I am. So, for promoting Protestantism, he was convicted of heresy and burned at the stake. In a poetic prayer he composed a few years before his death in 1546, we read, "We offer and present unto thee, O Lord, ourselves, our souls and bodies, to be a reasonable, holy, and living sacrifice unto thee, humbly beseeching thee that we and all others who shall be partakers of this holy communion may worthily receive the most precious body and blood of thy Son, Jesus Christ, be filled with thy grace and heavenly benediction, and made one body with him, that he may dwell in us and we in him." Communion through consumption of food links food with the body and matter, with spirit taking us to a point of utmost importance for Christian theology. What we call Christian materialism, paraphrasing, as a matter of fact, in a way, the current of historical materialism, the ideological current that changed history in Eastern European countries in the 20th century. Now, the Orthodox liturgy developed around the core of Jewish liturgical practices, such as the daily prayers, which were transformed into the office of hours in the Byzantine Rite. By the 1st century AD, the liturgy of the hours was shaped in a form very close to what we have today. 3 daily services marking each day in the morning, noon, and evening. The origins of these prayers are to be sought out in classical Judaism, with the 3-part daily prayer dating from the time of Exodus and initiated by the 3 patriarchs: the morning prayer by Abraham, the noon prayer by Isaac, and the evening prayer by Jacob. Both in Judaism as well as in Christianity, the liturgy of the hours fulfilled the urge of prayer without ceasing, like, for example, we read in Paul's epistle to Thessalonians 5:17. In the framework of this ritual, the first Christian meals, commonly known as agape, as love, a love meal that people were sharing, and associated with ancient Christian worship, gradually evolve into the divine liturgy, where the faithful partake of the body and blood of Christ, the bread and the wine that in the Orthodox tradition is said not to be actually transubstantiated as in the Roman Catholic sense, but which through the energy of the Holy Spirit acquires the properties of the true body and blood of Christ. In the Gospel of St. John, after the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, the evangelist depicts Christ walking on the Sea of Galilee, crossing it and finding himself in Capernaum at the opposite side of the lake. The crowd follows him from the land, and Christ, or through the lake, but taking boats, and Christ speaks about the difference between material and spiritual food, material and spiritual hunger. He addresses the crowd, telling them, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, you seek me not because you saw the miracles, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Labor not for the meat that perishes, but for that meat which endures everlasting life." And further down, he asserts, I am the bread of life. He that comes to me shall never hunger, and he that believes on me shall never thirst. The same spiritual hunger and thirst is indicated also in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5:6, where it is said, "Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." In Christian spirituality, the longing of God is perceived in terms of a physical experience, perceptible through the senses, palpable, tangible, intense, deep, and profound. And the experience of man's meeting with him is similarly physical, deep, and profound. God is experienced through his presence in the divine liturgy, where he is consumed by the faithful for whom he has sacrificed. The key for the understanding of this overwhelming physicality in the experience of God in Christianity, and more specifically in the Orthodox tradition, is the notion of the incarnation. How God became incarnate, how God became man through the conception of the Word, how he was born an infant from the Virgin Mary, experienced human condition, hunger, thirst, toil, fatigue, joy, sorrow, and even death. Cyril of Alexandria, in the context of the Nestorian controversy in the 5th century, was an important figure for the development of incarnational theology, as he interpreted the scriptures according to the Alexandrian school of interpretation, which propounded the metaphorical rather than the literal exegesis, interpretation of the Bible, supported by the followers of the school of Antiochia, the Antiochian school. What the two approaches meant has to be understood within the broader philosophical framework of late antiquity in the Eastern Mediterranean. In order to emphasize the mystery of the Incarnation, as well as the full humanity of Christ, Cyril formulated the doctrine of communicatio idiomatum, or communication of idioms. Now, according to this doctrine, in the Incarnation, divine and human natures experienced one another's attributes. In the person of Christ, the Godhead experienced human suffering and pain and grief and joy. And Christ, in the fullness of his humanity, experienced thirst and hunger and heat and cold, just like man tasted the possibility of salvation and of divinity. The Greek word antidosis, employed by Cyril, refers us directly to this sharing of experiences between humanity and divinity. Cyril argued strongly for the unity of the person of Christ, and the theory of the communication of idioms served precisely this purpose in that cross-referential language that legitimized paradoxical formulations and terms such as Theotokos, which normally would make really no sense. It was the term that was employed for Mary, the Mother of God. How a human can be really the Mother of God. It was a formulation that was propounded in order to show in the extremity the communication of idioms. Another interesting statement was that God has died on the cross. The apparent contradictions served in order to signify the full appropriation of human nature by Christ. It was certainly not accidental that during the same time, and along with the debate over the suffering of Christ, the term Mother of God became the focal point of the controversy between Nestorius and Cyril, between the Alexandrian and the Antiochian school, but also between Constantinople and Alexandria at the time. Mary and the suffering of Christ denote the two most important moments in the earthly life of Christ, his birth and his death. They epitomize the mystery of the Incarnation in a symbolic and most comprehensive way. As part of this presentation, in which thoughts related to food and spirit as food were gathered and presented in the context of theological developments in the Eastern Mediterranean, I would like to conclude with some images and very few thoughts on a topic that I believe that sheds light to the importance of food as a real source of life, but at the same time as a source from which man draws material for his spiritual growth and evolution. I will show you a few images of the Virgin of God, the Virgin with child, the Mother of God, of the type lactans. Now, this is a very interesting iconographic, one of the many of the Mother of God, where the Mary is shown breastfeeding Christ the child. And the first example is what we see here in a not very well preserved, but still here it is, from the 3rd century AD. It's the catacomb of Priscilla, where we see the Mother of God with child at the center, and which has been very much associated with the Egyptian goddess Isis breastfeeding horrors. In the examples of the galactotrophusa, as she is called, as the iconographic type is called in Greek, we see that the physicality on the one hand is asserted, but on the other hand, it is not really presented and depicted in a realistic way, thus emphasizing the spiritual rather than the physical aspect of the iconography. And the same thing goes for the Western depictions of the Mother of God lactans. In the West, this type flourishes from the 13th century onwards, and the type is also adopted by Russian iconography from the 11th, 12th century onwards. Now, through these glimpses of the narratives and the significance transmitted through the theological connotations of food and spirit as food, and the iconographic example of the breastfeeding Virgin, I hope I have shown part of this complex scale of meanings and symbols interwoven in secular and religious daily life in history and in the present. The dialectic of food as a symbol of necessity and spirit as a symbol of transcendence coincide at the point where good and evil, matter and spirit, temporary and eternal, meet parallel to the perennial interaction of necessity and gift. The gift of food throughout ages comes to affirm love, whether it is the love of God for his beloved people or of the love of the Mother of God for Christ. Food becomes the vehicle that pulls man back to salvation, reversing the route of history and leading him back to paradise from which he was expelled, tasting the fruit. Salvation has the taste of eternity, and eternity has a taste. The senses come to affirm the tangibility, palpability, and actuality of the invisible, of the world to come, and which permeates the present life. Thank you very much.
Dear colleagues, thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution. Let's open the third part of our session. That means the questions and the comments. If you have any question, please. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk, Mr. Koder. I have a question that relates to the genres that you employ in pursuing and finding the information about food. I was a few days ago reading Paul of Egina, who is a famous physician of the 7th century, and he, for pages and pages, he talks about different types of food, of course not for consuming it at the table, but for medical purposes. I was wondering, if this is for study of food, history of food, if medical sources would be very helpful for such a study. Also, relating to this, I have another question. in the sources that you studied, that you examined, did you find any reference to the humoral theory, the four humors? And did the Byzantines really, four humors, humoral theory, whether Byzantines really, care about this, or it is just, some intellectual, obsession of some doctors of the medieval times?
Thank you for the question. I confess that I did not use in depth and systematically the medical sources. Of course, I know Paul from Egina and also his surrounding, but I was trying to find out everyday food bottom up, and so my system was based on not many sources. You understood? I think you understood immediately that my main source was Ptochoprodromos and a certain other texts like Nicholas Grammaticos in his advices for Lenten and so on. And then I entered with keywords into the TLG, and of course, Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, and by this method, I filtered out information from the medical sources, but I did not read medical sources in length. This is not only because I'm too lazy, which is a good argument for medical sources, but also because the medical informations in general have nearly no relation to everyday alimentation. This is a separate level. Even the doctors learn to be doctor by a doctor. If you go to any other job, yeah? So they didn't read Paulus of Egina or ancient doctors. This is a separate level, and I'm sure Michael Psellos, who would be a dangerous doctor, knew more about medical sources than any doctor in Constantinople at his time. So this is my reason for this. Yeah, and so my answer is negative no, also on humor. But I recommend really to make broad surveys in the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, TLG, and please make it as long as the old internet system is still working, because I have the new one and the old one, and the new one is terrible.
If I may say, there is an interesting PhD by Maria Chroni, which refers to exactly, and Professor Koder has been involved in it. So, where you are going to find all the relevant material for medical sources and for the reception of the human theory.
I'll be very happy to get the reference. And sorry if I'm keeping you too long, but I noticed on your images, there is a reference to malachon, which you translated as Jewish mallow. Is it marshmallow that we know of? Marshmallow, that Jewish marrow? Because in the end, it's Altea officinalis, malachon or molachon. And I thought that malachon was marshmallow, and I didn't hear anything about Jewish mallow. So what is Jewish mallow? I mean, maybe it's my ignorance.
Well, the English word I found for moluchie, or molochin in Greek, was Jewish mallow. And if you buy it was not in Cairo, it was in another place, I bought moluchie, and we tried to make a soup. I didn't like it. It's like spinach, but it's very dangerous to slide on it if it's cold or so. You understand? I didn't like it. And they also explained that this is Jewish mallow, so I confess I can't give you an answer. I don't know if in Turkey, moluchie, the Turkish word exists, if I'm right, but if it is still used, if they eat it, it's the climate for moluchie is a more hot climate. I would try to plant it. I would not try to plant it. If I would try to plant it, I would try to plant it in Levant, Palestine, or Egypt, or so, not here. It's not kata to klimatis Constantinopolios, as the text of Geoponica says.
Molochia, still now, is a very popular plate in Cyprus. Molochia.
Yeah. And did you eat?
Yes, of course.
Did you
and
eat?
I like it very
like
much. Yes.
Yeah.
As
Well,
I like the spinach too.
So the tastes are different, and at least if you like it, so 50% here in this room like it, and this is a simple explanation that it is still planted. Yeah. I could just add that between us there's a medium level of alimentation with very specific human symbolic character. I mean, for example, salt. To eat salt and bread together, things like this. This is not, this was not the highbrow ideology of nature, but it's not the everyday alimentation, but it's of a strong symbolic character. And of course, salt is difficult because if you read there's the well-known saying of Jesus, what shall we do with salt when? But I made some research on salt, and you can't ruin salt. Salt always is salt. So perhaps it was an error of the writer, not of Jesus, of course, but of the writer. No, I mean it's a mistake in the Bible, because it's impossible. How to destroy salt? Throw it in the water, and the water is salt, and take it out and dry it, and it's salt. Bashkajok.
If you want.
Very briefly, thank you very much. First of all, I have to excuse myself from our distinguished speakers, especially from Professor Koder, because I didn't have the opportunity to listen to all of a very interesting speech, because I was in a church mess nearby here with His Holiness the Patriarch on the temple of the Church of Constantine and Helen. Professor mentioned, Ms. Tsironi, that Constantine was the founder of the city, Constantinople as it was called, and tomorrow actually is his name day, which is also the birthday of the saint. So there was a church mess, and I was there, and after the mess, in the community, a small community house, they were giving drinks and some sort of food. It's called kerasma in Greek, which is also part of the tradition of the ritual to combine the church life with everyday life, if I might say so. So I would like, first of all, to say to you how happy I am, because in one of my first days here as Consul General of Greece coincide with this very important, with the end of this very important circle of lectures, which were organized here at the Sismanoglio Megaro by the National Hellenic Research Institute, and especially by Mrs. Evangelia Balta, the head of the Ottoman and Byzantine Studies, one of the most well-known researchers in Greece. And believe me, I'm a diplomat, I'm not a scientist, but I know what I'm telling you, because I have actually, by coincidence, some very close family relations with National Hellenic Research Foundations. So I know exactly what I mean, and we are very happy here. I can today announce you that this very nice program will be continued next year with the help of Ms. Balta. This is something, and I see here that the audience is a very special one. I mean, judging also from the question which was posed here to the lecturers. So that means that It's very, people of knowledge who come here and listen to these very interesting lectures, which give us great pleasure. And allow me also here to thank my colleague and associate, Mr. Victor Maligoudis, who has invested all his creativity, strength to have here this very nice program at the Sismanoglio Megaro. So again, congratulations for the lectures. Thank you very much again for giving this opportunity. Looking forward to continuing this cooperation next year. Thank you very much. Inshallah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of this year's lectures, which were aimed at presenting specific disciplinary perspectives, based on sound research of the Byzantine and Ottoman eras. We hope that this series of conferences has helped you to understand some aspects. Given the vastness of the subject, there is no way these lectures can offer up a complete meal. It was just an appetizer. Thank you all for your participation. You have been an amazing audience, always present through rain and snow. My sincere thanks go to all those who have worked to make these lectures a success. The list is long, and I am deeply, deeply grateful to you all. And now, please go to enjoy a cup of bean soup, cooked by the master of Chia restaurant, our dear friend, Musabey. Musabey, thank you. He is absent because he participates in the committee of the new fascicule of his periodical. Thank you very much. I wish you, once again, a healthy and happy summer, and I will be glad to see you in the next year. Thank you. Thank you again. Πάμε τώρα τα φασούλια. Φασούλια.
Τέλειο. My paper, I was only proud, ήμουν περήφανη μόνο και μόνο για το πιάτο τα φασόλια που βρήκα.